I think we will begin. We are at 3 and we have a very lean day today, so we probably might have a few more people joining us, but I'll just request Professor Mitra to have a couple of words and then it will be one.
Thank you, Mukhendu. And since it's mostly family, you're all familiar with my ritual litany when we get these things started. And we have worked out a division of labor. My business is to introduce ISAS to the speaker, and the chair's business is to introduce the speaker to the audience. So you have known ISAS always, but the ISAS that is happening now is a new thing. It's a new thing in the sense that it is, I'm now stealing Johnson's words, it's shaping to be a brain trust on South Asia or Singapore. That's how modestly we present ourselves. Now, you can't have any real brain trust without a real lawyer telling us the rights and wrongs of any particular decision to make. More seriously, we are delighted that ISAS is connecting the Institute to the important, sensitive, powerful, globally visible parts of NUS already, of which you are a leading part. And I certainly hope this talk, which will surely create a vigorous discussion to follow, will resurface, carrying a flavor of the discussion as one of our working papers. We'll be very grateful and very proud. And as in fundraising, you know, the rule is, those who have given will give again. So don't be surprised if ISAS comes back to you again and again. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Professor Mitra. I'll probably just give you a bit of background to how Makam got to be integrated into giving this talk. This was a conversation which we had at ISAS sometime in November last year. And this was in fact an issue which was raised by Mr. William, where he mentioned that India was about to introduce major amendments to the Companies Act. And the Indian industry, led by the CII, had had a conversation. And one of the points that was mentioned in that conversation was that Singapore has its companies legislation, which is one of the most advanced, streamlined, structured corporate legislations in the world. And what are the elements from that legislation that can go into the series of amendments that proposed to the Indian legislation, and whether ISAS can contribute to anything in that respect. So, obviously we are not experts in this, but try to think of a few things, Rahul, myself, and a couple of other colleagues. And then we thought that while that is an ongoing process, legislation will take its own course, we would like to know a little bit more about this and maybe explore the possibility of an expert, a real expert who knows this thing flesh and blood, to let us know about where India stands on this, what are the amendments that are being proposed, what are the amendments that are being implemented, and where does it need to take this forward, because none of us are really, with the exception of Aisha, none of us are trained lawyers here, but I think what we understand, sorry. So what we do understand is that this is an important step in correcting what is being popularly referred to as improving the doing business conditions. So this is inevitably an important part of that. So that's how Makam got integrated into this, and our friend and colleague Rahul Mukherjee, I, Johnson, we have all been co-conspirators in this. Rahul is unfortunately not here with us today. He had some other engagements. But we are hoping that the fact that Umakant has agreed to speak on this subject at an ISA association means the beginning of a long association, and also probably the fact that this is something on which we will have more exchanges, more discussions down the line, and now we know that if we need to respond to this subject, we know that we have somebody with us whom we can trouble at short notice. Many of you would be knowing Umakant because we have been together in this campus for a few years before we left Virginia. Umakant is an assistant professor at the law faculty, and his specializations in corporate law, governance, and he's one of those who looks at both India and Singapore, so that perspective is very much there in his larger insights that he's going to share with us. He has been teaching at other than the university, teaching at the Fordham Law School in New York, historical University of Redwood, in various law schools in India, and he's of course, he might himself want to tell a little bit about this, but he's a recipient of various academic medals and honors, and he has also been a practicing lawyer, so he brings both sides of exposure and specialization. He got his PhD from NUS, and he also has an LLM from the New York School of Law, and prior to that, the first degree from Bangalore Law School. So, Umakant, I will give it to you now. You have a PowerPoint. So, maybe it's a, as you can see, it's a academic material gathering. So, 30 minutes, let's have this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rudrava and Professor Khalid. It's indeed a pleasure to be here to spend time with colleagues at ISAS. I've attended several seminars of ISAS, but never had the chance to collaborate all these years. So I think, as both of you mentioned, it's a new beginning, and I'm looking forward to more work in this area of corporate and business laws that I focus on, both in terms of India as well as comparatively in terms of other jurisdictions as well. So as we discussed, the topic that I'm going to be speaking on today relates to current reforms that the Government of India is considering to the Companies Act, which itself is a fairly new legislation which was passed in 2013. This is a somewhat technical area, but I'll try to be as lay person friendly as possible rather than go into too much legalese and jargon. So before we get into the area of what the changes are, and I know some of you are interested in politics, so I just want to discuss a little bit of why the legislation was passed the way it is and why these changes have come about. So to start with, we need to think about why the Companies Act of 2013 was passed and what is it that went behind the legislation of 2013. And a little bit of historical insight would be in order. So as some of you may be aware, the previous companies legislation in India was the Companies Act of 1956. So that legislation has stood for nearly 5 decades or longer, and that has been kind of the longest company legislation India has ever had, because India has had many other legislations on company law before that. So in a sense, it's been a fairly long-standing legislation, but that underwent a lot of amendments over a period of time. So what was the driver behind looking at a new legislation? The idea was it was necessary to modernize company law. And the idea of modernizing company law has been going on in India for nearly 2.5 decades now. The earliest proposals to come up with a new company law can be dated back to the early 1990s. So since then, the government has been trying, let's come up with a new company law that is consistent with the times. Several attempts were made in the 1990s, but nothing really fructified. So one of the things that really is the driver behind the new Companies Act of 2013 is something called the Irani Committee report. And this was headed by a very well-known industrialist, Mr. J.J. Irani of the Tata Group. And J.J. Irani was tasked with the idea of coming out with a new company legislation, which is very modern and in tune with the times. And this is important because this committee which proposed the legislation was headed by an industrialist, not by a politician, not by a lawyer, not by a bureaucrat. It was by an industrialist, and it was also populated substantially by people from industry, by lawyers, by advisors, and by industrialists. So the whole mindset was to have a legislation that is modern, which means ease of doing business. So how do we attract capital? How do we make it easy for entrepreneurs? That was the whole idea of the Irani Committee report, although they did think about investor protection as well to a large extent and corporate governance, but the idea was how do we facilitate businesses being carried on, how do we attract capital, especially foreign capital. So that was the idea behind the committee report, based on which bills were presented in Parliament. There was a bill in 2008 that was presented in Parliament that was based on the Irani Committee report. But what happened when the Irani Committee report was recommended and the Companies Bill of 2008 was presented in Parliament? There's something that kind of shook the corporate ecosystem in India, and that all of you know what happened in 2009, one of which was the Satyam scandal. Right? So the bill was presented in Parliament, it was very business friendly, but what you suddenly had was this huge scandal that threatened the whole corporate India as well as the IT sector, which is then and continues to be very important for India's business and India's prestige and credibility in the overseas market. So what happened was then the whole idea started changing because of this important cataclysmic event that took place in 2009, and the shape of the bill started getting changed thereafter. And why did the shape of the bill start getting changed? Because the bill was later on referred to the Standing Committee of Finance in the Parliament, which was headed by Mr. Yashwant Sinha. So the bill, which was kind of fairly investor friendly, fairly business oriented, because of Satyam and the backlash from Satyam, was referred to the Standing Committee, and the Standing Committee made very, very significant changes to the bill. And these changes to the bill were to increase compliance, and the idea, to one can imagine, would have been to say, okay, let's ensure that another Satyam does not happen. Right? So very, very significant controls, very significant corporate governance norms, and higher standards of governance and compliance. And these were actually introduced by various recommendations made by the Standing Committee report, which went into hundreds of pages. I don't recall exactly now, but the committee report was almost 400 odd pages. And that is actually the important event due to which compliance requirements became very, very stringent in the Companies Act as a result of recommendations made by the Standing Committee for Finance in 2010 first, and then later in another report in 2012. And one important factor here is, this time around, the people who are key players in this discussion, in this rule-making process, were not the industrialists, but they were from the political spectrum. Right? So it was the parliamentarians who were kind of taking this spearheading role in terms of increasing the compliance requirements. Of course, there was industry involved. There was a Ministry of Corporate Affairs which was constantly engaged with the industry, but the push actually came from the political spectrum. So what you effectively have in the Companies Act of 2013 is this tension-filled kind of a compromise that began with something that is very business-oriented and ended up, because of an event or a series of events that took place, getting a lot of pushback from the political class. And therefore what you really have in the end is this compromise position, which is what has led to a lot of dissatisfied consumers of the Companies Act of 2013, because it's in no one's interest. It helps businesses in some ways, but it also adds to a lot of cost in some ways. So I think it's useful to get into a little bit of this background before we understand what actually has happened in the bill and what the government is trying to do now with this new bill, because this actually came up due to a large extent from deliberations that took place in the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance. So that's a little bit about the background with the 2013 Act itself. So what does the 2013 Act do? It came into effect in 2013, but this Act is now being brought into force in stages. This Act is not effective altogether. Right? There are several provisions of the Act which are effective, other provisions are not effective, and I'll come to a little later as to why some of the provisions have not yet been made effective. So what we today have is a transition stage in company law in India, where you have the new law applying for a lot of things, but the old law continuing to apply for other matters. So in sometimes, people might say it's a lawyer's delight, right? Because clients are always going to go to lawyers for opinions, because there are a lot of interpretation issues and a lot of legal compliance issues that arise because of the transition phase that we are in. And I guess that's where some of ISAS's own constituents in terms of companies wanting to invest in India or Singapore companies wanting to do business in India will also face some of these concerns, because we are really in a transition phase currently. So what does the new company law do? Again, I'm not going to get into too much of the technicalities given the time, but given the background that I mentioned, you see two specific streams in terms of the philosophy of the Act. On the one hand, the idea on the left-hand side is to try and make it as modern, as dynamic, and as contemporary as possible, given the developments that are occurring around the world. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, there are also a lot of influences in terms of greater control on companies, greater requirements for monitoring, management, monitoring the businesses, both in terms of government monitoring as well as through self-regulation and self-monitoring mechanisms in company law. So to that extent, there is a lot of restrictions that have been placed in terms of the company law itself. So given the background, what is the government trying to do now? In a sense, how is the government trying to address this difficult situation or delicate situation that has arisen? And these developments have really taken place in the last year or so, since the new government came into power. And the influencing factors behind that, of course, are the stated position of the new government to attract greater foreign investment. And it's also linked with this whole Make in India campaign, which requires a lot of capital to come in, especially from foreign investors and also from domestic investors, for which you need to have a corporate regime which is conducive to attracting this kind of investment. And one thing certainly the new government has been quite keeping a very close eye on the ball is regarding the rankings of India on the doing business World Bank spectrum. And the government has already been taking a lot of measures, to improve India's rankings from 142 out of 189, which is what it is currently under the World Bank 2015 ranking. So a lot of these measures that the government is taking, including the amendments proposed to the Companies Act, is largely linked to this idea about doing business, and perhaps also to ensure that these changes will enhance the ranking of India in the doing business report. And I've heard statements being made such as, even if we go up 10 ranks, that would be good enough from India's perception point of view, because either India has been stagnant or actually moving a few notches down. So that is the kind of statements that the government has been trying to make in the recent past. So what is it that the government is trying to do? As I said, this is what the government is trying to address, right? How do we reduce the cost of doing business? And to a large extent, legislation such as this, and in the US, for example, there have been legislation in the last 10 to 15 years. After the Enron crisis, there was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 in the US. After the recent global financial crisis, there has been the Dodd-Frank Act. So to a large extent, there have been studies which show that there is actual increase in the cost of doing business. And many studies in the US, for example, on these legislations have even quantified what that cost is of doing business, because you have to hire more auditors, you have to pay more to the managers because their risk is going up, your directors may be exposed to liability, so you have to pay them more, insurance costs go up for directors and officers' liability. So, of course, in India, I don't think yet anybody has quantified what is the cost that has gone up, but perhaps there are ways by which one can study, and it might require a different skill in terms of econometrics to do that, but it is possible to study what is the increase in cost of doing business. So the latest round of changes that the government has suggested is how to reduce this aspect of doing business. So how can we minimize the cost of doing business? So what has the government done in terms of easing the doing of business in the 2013 Act? And it's a bit technical here, but I'll keep it very brief. There are many ways that the government has tried to undertake in the last year or so to minimize the rigidity of the Companies Act. The first is the government has exercised rule-making power. So one thing which is good about the Companies Act is it gives a lot of power to the central government to pass by rules and also to allow for exemptions through rules. So the government has come up with rules almost on a weekly basis in trying to minimize the impact of the Companies Act. And again, due to want of time, I won't get into the details of those. So that's one strategy that the government has been following. The second strategy that the government has been following in some cases when there are problems with interpretation is to pass what is known as, is literally called this, right? Removal of difficulties orders. So if there's some problem with interpretation, people are not clear what it is, the government says here is a removal of difficulties order, so we're clarifying what the question of interpretation is in the Companies Act. But the first two methods have their limitations because none of these can supersede the legislation itself. Right? So the government cannot pass rules or orders which will go against the text of the legislation because the text of the legislation can only be changed by legislative amendments. And which is what the government has now tried to do in a bill which was presented in Parliament late last year, which is the Companies Amendment Bill of 2014, which was passed by the Lok Sabha on 12th of December and is currently pending in the Rajya Sabha as we speak. I understand that it was presented by the Minister for Corporate Affairs, Mr. Jaitley, in Rajya Sabha yesterday, and it's listed on items of business for today. I don't know, it's very difficult to take a guess on what's going to happen in the Rajya Sabha, whether it will be taken up in the first place, whether it will be passed, I don't know, I'm not the best judge of that, but it is the case that this is currently pending in the Rajya Sabha, and we might know a decision very soon on this. Although the government has suggested some further amendments to this bill as well. So let me briefly give you an idea of what some of the key changes suggested are. Of course, these are the drivers, ease of doing business. They're also trying to correct some mistakes and also trying to address some demands from various stakeholders. So some of the changes that are being suggested. So, for example, and some of these may sound very minimalistic or very simple, but they may have a larger impact. So, for example, one of the requirements under company law is every company has to have a minimum paid up capital, which means a person has to bring in a certain amount of money in order to incorporate a company, which is 100,000 for private and 500,000 for public companies. And the idea is this may not seem like a big amount for some people, but for startup companies, for small and medium-sized enterprises, this could actually act as a bar. So one of the things that the Companies Act is now trying to do in the amendment is let's not have a paid-up capital. So you can start. Actually, you can have a private company which is not listed, and you can have a public company which is either listed on the stock exchange, or you can also have an unlisted public company. So whether you are listed or unlisted, the moment you incorporate as a public company, you have to have a minimum 500,000 paid up capital.
So companies that call themselves public limited.
Yes, public limited company. So there are specific requirements. So for example, in a public limited company, whether listed or not, it's difficult to prevent transfer of shares. And there are many other changes, many other factors that alter between public and private, but public could include unlisted as well as listed. So I think some of the questions that arise, and this is where Singapore comes in, right? And again, I don't want to get into too much of the technicalities here. Singapore has abolished a lot of these requirements many, many years ago. And there are many requirements which continue to be there in the Indian Companies Act, which, for example, are not there in countries like in Singapore. So, for example, in India, there's a requirement that whatever business the company is going to carry on has to be in the incorporation documents of the company. So, if you start a business, that business has to be there in the memorandum of association. If it is not there, then that becomes an invalid or an illegal activity. So if you start a telecoms business and then you want to go into shipping, you can't do so unless you amend the objects clause. Now this, for some reason in India, this and many other aspects are some things that have continued to be there from the English Companies Act, and since independence in the 1956, they just continue in the new act, and I can't see any reason why these have continued or these should continue. So one of the things I'm going to park here is if any kind of amendments or suggestions need to be proposed, I think there's a lot more that can be done from the Singapore context. So Singapore does not require some of these requirements, which even the UK has abolished to a large extent. Many other countries have abolished, but for some reason India continues to hold very dearly. Although in practical terms, it may not really make much of a difference at the end. So I won't get into the details too much, but I think we can, in the next stage of this discussion, maybe or in writing, we can get into some of the more concrete kind of amendments. Few other things the companies bill does. So I don't know whether it was a mistake or not. There was a requirement in the Companies Act which says that board resolutions of companies need to be made available for public for inspection. Now, nowhere are board resolutions available for public inspection because board resolutions could contain sensitive information, competitive information, which need not be disclosed. Usually, it's only shareholder resolutions that are available for public consumption. Whatever happens with the board stays with the board. Only a summary is provided to the public. Whereas this would have exposed companies to too much obligations if board resolutions became public. So one of the things the amendment does is to say no, board resolutions will not be made public, which is probably fair. It may have crept in either consciously or unconsciously, but at least that is currently being corrected. And that is one of the changes again that the company's amendment bill has brought about. A few other things again are examples of what could have been quite severe, but which have now been addressed under the company's bill, and this was a pretty serious issue. So what the company's bill said is if there is any kind of non-compliance or fraud in the company, and the auditor of a company discovers the fraud, the auditor has to report it to the central government. Right? So even if it is a fraud, let's say of 100 rupees or 1,000 rupees, there was a requirement that has to be reported to the central government. And so the people who went up in arms against this were the auditors. So the auditors began saying that our role is going to be quite significant. We have to start looking for things which are very minimal in nature and also report that to the central government. So it exposes businesses to a lot of scrutiny. And this was something that was heavily criticized both by the audit community as well as the business community. And so what the government is doing now is to try and bring about some kind of a media to say that only material frauds beyond a certain amount that the government will stipulate will be disclosed by the auditor to the central government. The other frauds which are below that limit will only be disclosed to the board, and the board, after the discussion, will put it in its board report to the shareholders. So there are two phases. Again, you can see that it sounds very minimal, but again, there was a lot of hue and cry on the part of the industry to say, let's make it something more realistic and not something so significant. Again, a lot of this you can see somewhere in the background you can see here something called Satyam. Right? There are questions of fraud. So how do we prevent fraud? So let's get the central government involved, but that may have been an overkill. So the idea is to try and make it something more meaningful, something more balanced, and that is something that the government has sought to do in this particular case. To me, the most important change this bill is going to come up with is something known as related party transactions. So if there's one thing that the government is trying to address most significantly, it is RPTs. So just by way of a background, what are related party transactions? This is an important feature of corporate governance. So related party transactions are quite prominent in Asia, and related party transactions usually arise when there are groups of companies. And groups of companies are quite common not just in India but also in several other Asian countries. And what group of companies allows management to do is to enter into transactions between the group to transfer value from one company to another, and usually value is transferred from a company where there are minority shareholders to a company in which the promoters have a larger stake. So when you have companies which are promoter oriented, which are quite common in India, so they may transfer value to their own personal companies and leave the listed company high and dry. So the idea of the 2013 Companies Act was we need to have very, very stringent regulations on related party transactions, which are almost not regulated at all in the past. So one of the criticisms of the previous act was there was almost no regulation of related party transactions. But now what you had in the 2013 Act is very, very severe restriction, very, very severe regulation on related party transactions. And what were those restrictions? They were, firstly, every related party transaction has to go to the board. So if you have 100 companies within your group, every single transaction that you have with another company has to go to the board for approval. Again, it increases cost of compliance. And more importantly, material related party transactions also have to go to the shareholders for approval. Right? Shareholders meet only once or maybe maximum only twice a year, but material transactions cannot be entered into without going to the shareholders for approval. And what kind of approval do you require? You need 75% majority. It's a very high threshold. Right? Now, it's not a simple majority. It is a 75% majority that is required. And this last part is very interesting, which is the person who is the related party cannot vote, even if that person is a shareholder. Right? So effectively, you are disenfranchising certain shareholders who are related parties from voting in the transaction. And I'll give you an example of a couple of examples of this, which will make it fairly clear. So what is the new company? What is the amendment trying to do here? The amendment is trying to do two things. One is reducing the 75% majority requirement to a simple majority of 50%. And then it makes a few other changes, which I won't get into in detail. But again, this is something which seems very small in terms of the changes, but it could have a significant impact. And I'll take a couple of cases very quickly in the little bit of time that I have to explore this a little further. So, what impact has this had? Although it's a very small change, what impact has this had on industry? And we see that it has had a couple of impacts already. The first is something that's been in the press a lot. I don't know whether it's been followed as extensively. But one of the cases which is already in the press relates to Maruti Suzuki, which, as we all know, is a manufacturer and sales company for cars. And what this company did is Maruti Suzuki has been manufacturing cars and selling cars, but Maruti Suzuki has a controlling shareholder today. It used to be a joint venture between the government of India and and Suzuki, but Government of India sold its shares to Suzuki, and Suzuki is currently the largest shareholder and is a controlling shareholder or promoter of Maruti Suzuki, which manufactures and sells cars. Last year, what Maruti Suzuki did, or Suzuki rather did, is it incorporated a 100% subsidiary, another company in Gujarat. And why did it do that? Of course, Gujarat would have given them a lot of incentives and so on, but Suzuki had a different plan. What Suzuki wanted to do was, it wanted to transfer all the manufacturing from Maruti Suzuki to its own 100% subsidiary. So what you're effectively doing is transferring value that is sitting here, where there are minority shareholders, to another company which is only owned by Suzuki. And what this company would do is it would manufacture the cars, sell the cars to this entity, which will in turn sell to customers. So this company, which was a manufacturing and sales company, now only becomes a selling company earning a commission, whereas all the profits are going to be in this company, which is 100% owned by Suzuki. And now this is a classic related party transaction, which before the Companies Act, they could have just done it. Then nobody would have been able to do anything. It was perfectly legal to do so. But what happened in the new Companies Act is they have to get an approval of this company's shareholders, in which Suzuki cannot vote, because Suzuki is the related party. So they have to get the minorities shareholder approval, and the minority shareholders have to approve it with a 75% majority. And today, compared to before, institutional investors and individual investors are getting more and more active in India. Like 5 or 10 years ago, nobody would have cared and the resolution would have passed through. But today, shareholders in India are quite active and may defeat this resolution. And so what Maruti Suzuki has done is they have kept this proposal in abeyance, because by the time they were planning all this, the new law came into effect. And so they decided that it's very risky for them to go through, because if they do so, this may not pass, they may not get 75% majority, which the new legislation is going to reduce to 50%. So now Maruti Suzuki is trying to wait and see whether the threshold is going to get reduced to 50%, then they have a better chance of getting approval from the shareholders. So you see that there is a case of direct impact that has occurred as far as this issue is concerned. And I'll briefly deal with the second case study, which is again something which has been in the press quite a lot, which is a company known as United Spirits, which was earlier owned by Vijay Mallya and has now been sold to a UK company called Diageo. And when you have groups of companies, as I mentioned, there can be a lot of related party transactions. And one of the reasons why this situation arose for United Spirits and why USL had to be sold out to a foreign party is because a related company, which is Kingfisher Airlines, collapsed. Right? And where did the money come to satisfy the cash needs of Kingfisher? It came from United Spirits. So that's a classic related party transaction again. Now, unfortunately for United Spirits, by the time they had to approve these transactions, the new law came into effect. And last year, 9 related party transactions were submitted to the shareholders of United Spirits. And this confirms what I said before, that shareholders have become active. All 9 of the transactions were defeated because the minority shareholders voted overwhelmingly against the transaction. Right? More than 25% have voted against the transaction in all of these cases, and therefore it again suggests that the new law has some impact, because this would have again gone through in the previous scenario, but it was clearly something that was prevented. And for those of you who've been following the papers thereafter, this has actually led to a bigger battle, where now people are saying that Vijay Mallya should step down, because a lot of these transactions have come up for scrutiny, and that's a different issue altogether. But this again suggests the kind of impact that the new law has as far as these issues are concerned. So, just to quickly sum up, I think one of the questions that arises is, has this law been too stringent? Perhaps the answer is yes. If you ask somebody who's interested in corporate governance, if you ask minority shareholder activists, they would say, yes, this is required. But if you ask business people, they will say this is too onerous. We cannot enter into transactions because if they keep getting defeated, that's going to increase the cost of doing business. Now, who is right? I think it's very difficult. It depends on which side of the debate one is in. That will really educate us about what it is, but that's really the scenario we have today. So the government is trying to tinker with some of these requirements, but it will have to satisfy both these kinds of constituencies. One is easing the doing of business, and the other is to ensure that minority is protected, corporate governance continues to be enhanced, and that's really the challenge that needs to be addressed. So finally, there are, again, I'm going to avoid some of the more technical issues at this point of time. There are some further changes that have been suggested to the Companies Act, which I don't think we need to get into too much detail at this point. There are more technical legal issues than overall kind of broader philosophical issues that we need to go through at this point of time. But what is my overall take on this bill? As we can see, I think the changes are too minimal in nature, right? So this is trying to send a message to industry saying that we are trying to make it easy to do business, but when I read the bill itself, it's nothing earth-shattering, right? There's minor tweaking here and there. There's nothing very significant. So one of the things we may have to think about is maybe what else needs to be changed in the bill, and to that extent, we may have to think about what does Singapore offer. And I gave you some examples of some of these issues as far as we saw. So I guess there is some need for further reconsideration of some of these issues. But there are some broader concerns that exist even beyond this new bill itself, which is a very small issue in the overall scheme of things. If we need to have greater ease of doing business, there are many more things that need to be implemented. And the first thing is corporate litigation. And from a foreign investor's point of view, this is a big question, right? If there's a corporate litigation, say between shareholders or between shareholders in the company, how are we going to resolve that dispute? And as we know, if a dispute gets into the court system in India, it's going to take several years or several decades, and that's not something that foreign investors or even domestic investors are going to be satisfied with. So what the Companies Act does is it sets up this new body called the National Company Law Tribunal. So the idea is to bypass the court system altogether, have a specialized body that deals with corporate disputes. The advantage is it has the expertise, it has the efficiency, and it also results in reduced cost and timing. But unfortunately, like anything in India, this itself is mired in litigation. There is a challenge against the establishment of the NCLT, which is pending in the Supreme Court. The arguments have been heard and a judgment is awaited. Judgment has been reserved, so soon we will know what the fate of the National Company Law Tribunal is. But in the recent past, the Supreme Court has struck down a few other tribunals similar to the NCLT. So I'm not very optimistic on what the outcome is, but of course the judges will have to decide what that is. So I think this is an important, none of this is covered in the bill, but it's going to be an important issue from a foreign investor point of view. The second is again a very long-lasting complaint as far as India is concerned, which is the lack of effective or efficient bankruptcy laws. And this has been an issue on the anvil for quite some time. There have been many committees that have looked at this issue. So today, the government is making it easier and easier to incorporate a company. You can do it in a matter of a few hours. But it's very easy, it's very difficult to liquidate a company. Right? So you have companies that keep getting incorporated, but almost very few that keep getting dissolved, because that procedure at the back end is extremely cumbersome and difficult. So the idea of a bankruptcy code is currently being considered, where a committee has been appointed by the government and an interim report has already been issued. So that will also have to be considered along with the Companies Act itself, because without a proper bankruptcy law, again, investors as well as creditors will find it difficult in order to undertake business in the Indian context. So that's again an issue which we have to consider along with the company law question. And finally, this is where there is some visible steps that's being taken by the government, which is consolidating all the licensing and approvals, not just under the Companies Act, but under various legislation. So today the idea is let's have one consolidated approval for setting up a business, for instance, as opposed to having umpteen number of approval requirements that are there, and many steps have already been taken as far as this issue is concerned, especially in the context of industrial licensing and foreign investment. So this is again a broader issue which will have to be considered along with the Companies Act itself. So I think in a nutshell, the idea is the company law reforms are helpful. They send a signal, but they are fairly minimal in nature. The outcome may not be as significant as what we might think it will be. It needs a whole look, again, not just in terms of company law itself, but also on some of the other legislation that we kind of briefly touched upon. And I'll stop at that and look forward to your comments, observations.